Can you hear me now? Okay. Fonnie and I are good friends. And just to give you a background, I've been an organic gardener for over 30 years. We've run our operation without the use of any synthetic miticides for over 20 years. I am not pro-pesticide in any way. I know the chief ecotoxicologist of the major chemical companies. I'm on speed dial with the chief ecotoxicologist for Bayer Chemical. I talk to all of them. And I can tell you that first thing, in the United States, the pesticide situation is way better than it's ever been. The state that I live in is the most heavily regulated state probably anywhere in the world for pesticide use. Any farmer that applies a pesticide, including me, if I'm using formic acid or thymol in my colonies, I have to file a pesticide use report with the state. You can look up on a public database in California any pesticide application by any farmer and the location and the timing at any time. So we have it very strong. I also talk to a lot of researchers throughout the United States who do the one thing that Fonnie was doing is collecting pollen samples and nectar samples in agricultural areas and in urban areas to see what the actual amount of pesticide contamination is. And it is surprisingly low throughout the United States, very, very low levels. When we look at causes of colony losses and ask the beekeepers in the United States, and you can look at the surveys reported by beekeepers themselves, what they report for suspected causes of colony losses, pesticides are way down on the list. They're almost insignificant in the United States. So obviously, you guys have work to do, okay, in the EU. And it's not about banning everything. It's about regulating them properly. Most farmers don't want to harm the bees. And I can guarantee you, no pesticide company wants to get the black eye of harming bees. They're working very hard at phasing out the more harmful pesticides and coming in now with the new biologicals and the much more eco-friendly pesticides. They've gotten the message loud and clear from society that we don't want our farming to be dependent upon neurotoxic pesticides, okay, with the type that Fonnie's talking about that affect the brains. So we're looking at, so the progress is slow, but it's getting better. I'm switching presentations now. The Varroa management one is very information dense. You've already had 2 information dense presentations by me today, so we're going to back off on that. I'll save that for tomorrow morning when you're more awake, okay? But in that, I talk about the integrated pest management of how you manage pests, starting off with biological controls and using synthetic pesticides as a last resort. That's what we use in our operation with our mite management. If we can get the agriculture community to start doing integrated pest management and reduce the amount of, instead of going straight to the synthetic pesticides and use those only as a last resort in small quantities, that would work much better, and it's totally doable. So yes, keep your pressure on the regulatory agencies, but it's not about just blanket bans. And it has to be realistic. If you're being unrealistic, they're not going to listen to you. The farmers also have a lot of say also. They need to continue to grow crops. With proper regulation and proper education of the farmers on how to control pests without just immediately doing what's called risk management. Instead of waiting until a pest is a problem, they just apply the pesticide without even monitoring for the pest. And that's way overuses the pesticide. So the long-term outlook is looking better. You do need to keep pressure on, but if you're not realistic about your demands, you're not going to be listened to. Back up your demands with hard data, understandable data, presented maybe a little easily than Fonnie did, that the politicians who are not chemists, they need to understand, and you need to be realistic. If you just demand, oh, ban all this, ban all that, they're not going to listen to you, okay? Be realistic. And that's what we have done in California, and we're doing across the United States. And we're working, the beekeepers rarely report pesticide issues in the United States anymore. And that's not to say there's nothing happening, especially at those sublethal levels, but we're able to keep healthy colonies on many agricultural lands. Okay, I'm swapping out now to talking about some of my research right here. And I was asked to speak about pollen substitute. Oops. First, here's my main areas of focus on my research. And all my research is funded solely by contributions from beekeepers. Okay, I don't get any money from universities, no money from grants, no money from the government, no money from private companies. I figured beekeepers, if they want to know answers, they can pay for it themselves. So if they send me checks, I get checks and donations to my website, almost every day, and that allows me to do this research. I don't do it for a profit. I'm retired now. I don't need to make any money. All the money goes into research. So mainly I'm looking at trying to understand varroa and varroa management. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Developing and testing sustainable varroa management methods and treatment. So I'm really glad to see the organic acids going through the regulatory process here in Europe. I'm pushing our EPA to expedite the registration of those. I'm working with a couple of beekeepers who are trying to get formulated products with oxalic acid out to the beekeepers. I'm very much involved. We'll talk tomorrow about breeding for mite resistance and then also colony nutrition. With the long-term drought in California, if we did not use protein supplement, we would not be able to supply bees because when there's no water, there's not much pollen out there. Okay, so let's go to this one right here from 2020 to look at the available pollen subs. First, understand that California grows 82% of the almonds on the planet Earth, okay? For a huge farm gate value, $4 billion to the farmers from this. And 1 million acres, that's 500,000 hectares, come into bloom all at the same time. This is how much of the California Central Valley looks. You can stand on a mountaintop and see nothing but almonds in bloom in all directions, okay? And they could not make a crop without honeybees, okay? And they pay a lot to rent these hives. I started out, when I first started pollinating almonds, at $10 rent per colony. The last couple of years, we've made $225 per colony, sometimes for a rental as short as 7 days. Okay? Big change in my career. And we get paid by how strong our colonies are around the 20th of February, when the trees are at 10% bloom. We get paid by frame strength, and our colonies are graded by an inspector, 10% of them, and say how many frames of bees there are, and we get paid by how strong they are. So a strong colony requires a good cluster going into the winter, so we do use pollen sub in the fall, because there's very little late pollen available. This is just dry. This is how it looks in our county right now. We live in a tinderbox, waiting for a strike of lightning or somebody to throw a cigarette butt, and everything goes up in flames. There's nothing in bloom right now. So we feed pollen substitute at this time of year, September and October, to stimulate season brood rearing. And again, as I said, we may do it in the springtime also if we move in early. So the question is, there's a number of pollen subs on the market. Do some perform better than others? I did a trial in 2013, testing out a number of the different brands that were available, and I used a control of patties made from natural mixed pollens mixed with some sugar syrup that we hand mixed together as a positive control, and the negative control was just feeding an equal amount of sugar alone with no protein. So on either side, you have a positive control of natural pollen sugar, and then you have a negative control of sugar alone with no protein. The end result was, here's what happened. This is the starting colony strength, an average of 5 frames of bees. And you can see what feeding only sugar alone, they nosedived, okay? They would not, and we put them in our worst yards, yards that we know have no natural pollen. The patties of natural pollen did, in this trial, perform the best. But notice this, a number of the pollen substitutes performed dang near as well as the natural pollen. So this is back in 2013. Come 2020, there were a number of new pollen supplements on the market, and some beekeepers asked me to run another trial, especially the beekeepers that made this homebrew formulation. They mix it up in truckload quantities. They're large beekeepers by themselves, and they said, Randy, we want to know how our pollen sub that we make by ourselves compares to what's on the market. Would you run a trial? So they coughed up the money to do that. So no manufacturers were involved in this, okay? Actually, one of the manufacturers offered to pay me $50,000 to run this trial. And I said, thank you very much. Keep your money. The beekeepers can pay for it. I don't want any influence from a manufacturer, okay? So that's what I do. So our negative, we did not run a positive control on this one. We ran just the negative control of sugar alone. The same amount of sugar as roughly was in any of these patties. This is one from Dadant company. This is the global patty, which had 15% natural pollen in it, okay? This is the homebrew, which had 20% natural pollen in it. None of the rest had any natural pollen in them. This is the one that we had been using from Man Lake. It's a bulk patty with no wrapper on it that we feed in the chunks. And this is one developed by a friend who worked for the USDA on the market, another Man Lake product. And then a new one with spirulina algae in it, which unfortunately they also added a high level of thyme oil to it from the thyme plant. And the bees found that to be repellent. So I think that had a negative effect on this. Here's my son out here. We ran this trial with 144 hives, and I replicated it in 3 different yards. So we tested, there are 18 hives, each got one of those pollen subs. You should always replicate any field trial in multiple yards to see if it's consistent from yard to yard, because there's a lot of variability in field research with honeybees. Obviously, it would be very confusing with 9 different pollen subs and all these colonies of yards, so we color-coded them all. We didn't care what the brand name was at all. So each one got a different color. We numbered these colonies. We did a randomized block design, which means you start off, we did it blocking by starting strength of the colonies, how strong they were. And of the 9 strongest colonies in a yard would be randomly assigned using a random number generator, one of the pollen subs. Then the next 9 would get 1 each of the pollen subs. And we put these sticky labels on the front of the hive so we could put the right color on each one. And we would measure out all the subs and color-coded, no names on them, and we would match the colors. And then a quality control person would then, after we put the patties on the top of each hive, they would walk around, make sure we had them all right so we don't want a mistake. It can be as you know, it can be very confusing, okay? So we are very meticulous scientifically that we don't make mistakes. You can get yelled at really easily by me or my sons if you are out working, because they grew up with a very hard taskmaster. You don't make mistakes when you're doing, as Rose can attest, while you're working, doing research with me. Okay. We chose intentionally yards that we knew that colonies would nosedive. We know that they would go downhill without being fed pollen sub. So normally, if we weren't going to feed them, there'd be no reason to put bees there, because in the summer they would die from starvation. So this would be one of the typical yards, right? Look at all this forage right here, okay? And then we fed them continually through the summer, from August until the end point just before going to almonds. We took a break during the winter with no feeding. This is our natural nectar dearth, and to our great surprise, in 2 of the yards, we got a short surprise bloom from the yellow star thistle, Centaurea. So we did not feed at that point. So these are feedings of protein, the yellow. These are feedings of sugar syrup right there. And then a natural pollen flow started at this point, which means that you only have 21 days that you can look to measure colony strength, because after 21 days, one brood cycle, the emerging bees could have been affected by that incoming pollen. So we graded our endpoint before the 21 days were up so that they would not be affected by that natural pollen flow. We fed them and we weighed any unconsumed pollen and kept track of that. And all of them were well consumed. The interesting thing was the colonies didn't grow. Normally, we can grow colonies in those yards if we feed pollen sub at a high rate. But when we looked what happened, I was very curious why the previous year we could grow them in that yard, but not in this year. But if you look at the difference, this was the 2020 temperature high. This was the year before when they did grow. It was much cooler the year before. We had very high temperatures. This is like 40 degrees C right here in October, okay, when normally they're growing. And the humidity was much higher in the previous year. It was much drier during this. So I think it had to do with the temperature and humidity, but I'm not sure. But we did not get much growth of colonies. But we still got, it's a comparative trial. You're comparing one to the other. So we can still compare the performance of one to the other. So at the midpoint in November, when we were done feeding for the first part of the trial, I graphed this out. They're color-coded. This would be no change. Only a few colonies actually increased in cluster size. Now, part of that was due to the temperature. When we started out, we measured the cluster size, how many frames covered with bees, when it was very hot. In November, it was much colder, so they were smaller cluster size. But again, we're comparing them relative to each other, so that doesn't make any difference. But notice we had mostly the reds up above. The greens and the whites lost strength tremendously. Some of the red colonies grew, and the blue ones looked pretty good. So the blue was the global patty, and the red was the home brew. Remember this red and the blue, because those are going to turn out to be the winners. I'm giving you a preview of this, and you can watch during this. Okay. So then mid-October, this would be typical brood nest then. Notice there is no bee bread whatsoever, no stored pollen. Their growth was solely based upon artificial feeding, okay? And yes, in October, we were rearing brood, but it was all artificial brood rearing. And they went into the winter. This is midpoint grading in November. This is my new trainee, my grandson, who was out of school due to COVID and turned out to be an excellent data collector and very good quality control person to make sure we did everything right. So when we feed a colony, somebody independently checks the number of the hive, checks on paper what they're supposed to be, and writes down what we did on everything. This was the average cluster size, how many frames covered with bees in November. And you can see the blue and the red ones were best, and the sugar controls were not doing too well. Notice how small the error bars are. It was very, very consistent, surprisingly consistent from colony to colony. And then I collaborated with Dr. Vince Resigliano from the USDA lab. He had all the pollen subs analyzed for nutritional content. I collected bees and froze them and sent them off to him. He dried them and then measured their head and thorax weights, which indicate how much they had grown. And that will tell you whether nutrition was the main factor. Notice the columns on the left are your head and thorax mass. The columns on the right are your frames of bees, how strong the colony was. Notice the very close correlation, indicating that this was due to nutrition and not due to something else. So the question is, which variables, wait a minute, is this, that should not be there. Oh, I think I have this in the wrong order. Okay, can pretend we or maybe some slides, our final grading, oh, I know what. This PowerPoint, if I'm having trouble, it's skipping slides. I skipped a slide. We had the final grading then in February. Okay, so now the question is, which variables correlated with performance? Was it the protein, the lipids in the pollen sub, the sugars, whether there was natural pollen, or the gut microbiome, okay? And Vince then, I took samples of bees, and he analyzed the gut microbiome. So here's the protein contents, okay? From the highest protein content to the lowest protein content. Of course, the negative control had 0 protein. And you can see performance did not correlate with protein content. Here's the lipid content. Performance did not correlate with the lipid content. One of the best performers had the lowest lipid content of any of them. These results were surprising to us, okay? Sugar content, broken down by sucrose, glucose, fructose, and total sugars. And total sugars I did in color, so you can match these here. Did not correlate with sugar content or sugar type. The gut microbiome. This is the community structure of the gut microbiome of the 5 major classes of bacteria found in the bee gut. Notice that the community structure was identical for all of them. I would have assumed that it would have to do that those bacteria would have evolved for natural pollen, and that we would see a different community structure when you fed artificial diet. That was not the case, okay? Did the structure, and now the height is the total amount of bacteria in the gut. I would have assumed that would correlate with the amount of natural pollen. That was not at all the case. One of the lowest had the highest content of natural pollen, and this one had a smaller amount. Okay, you getting confused? Nothing we saw here was what we expected to find. And I love that in science. Because if it's not what you expect, you have a chance to learn something new. You've got to throw out everything you thought and start from scratch. Oh, by the way, I had some colonies that were potential breeder queens. So they got no oxalic acid treatments during the trial. And when I took samples to send off for the gut analysis, I said, oh, wow, we have several that got no exposure to oxalic acid. Let's see if we can tease out if there was an adverse effect on the gut microbiome due to the oxalic acid. And you can see no apparent effect of oxalic acid. That's good news. So, still more questions than answers at this point. What variable correlated with the performance? Okay, so the analysis was at that point. Okay, so now we resumed feeding in December and then built them up. So this would be late winter. Rebuild, again, no natural pollen in these combs, okay? And here's our final grading. Now, the final grading was an ice-cold day, so the cluster sizes were small again. So you can't go by the absolute value. You have to just go by the comparative value of this. These are my 2 sons and a friend recording. Okay, so now this is the no change right here. Look at the colors now. Which colors are above on the growth? If they grew, they were up. If they shrunk, they were down. So this is at the very end point. Notice the reds and the blues. They tended to grow. The whites and the greens tended to shrink. Here's a typical yard of the starting cluster size up here. So we started out around 8.5 frames of bees, average cluster size. And they gently shrunk, and then they grew up, but two clearly outperformed the rest. But this one also did pretty well right here. So that's high pollen. Next one. One of the problems with this is this manufacturer decided to cut corners and shift to a different yeast that year. And that pollen sub did not perform as well as it normally did. They got complaints by beekeepers all over the country, and they've shifted back now. My guess is and we're feeding this one right now to our colonies, and my guess is this would be right up here with those, with zero pollen in there. So I very much question whether natural pollen is necessary when feeding a high-quality pollen sub. Now, percent of colony losses. How many colonies died during this trial, independent of going queenless? So these were all colonies that still had a queen. The sugar controls, noticed, about 30% of them died. They just simply starved to death. They had plenty of, they did not run out of honey by any means. Their boxes were full of honey. They had no protein, and the cluster sizes just shrunk. That's how severe these yards are where we are keeping bees, okay? And no losses for the global, and only very small for the homebrew. Just to show you the distribution of so this is a histogram of our ending colony strength right here. How many colonies fell into this group? So these are ones that went down to a single frame of bees. And so these sugar controls, they averaged less than 3 frames of bees. The ones fed the homebrew averaged 8.3 frames of bees on the same day. Can you see the obvious difference between the unfed colonies and the fed colonies? Very, very, you don't have to run statistics to get this is not just a 5%, this is a monster difference between the two. When we counted up the total for the group, and we make about $25 per frame going to almonds. I said, let's just go by what the beekeeper cares about. How much money goes into your pocket? Okay? So we count by total number of frames for the group of 18. For the 18 colonies in each test group, when we went to almonds, out of those 18 colonies, how many total frames of bees could we have rented? 3.5 times as many in this group than the sugar control. That's a big, big difference to the commercial beekeeper who's trying to make money. Okay? So there is no question that some pollen subs are way more cost-effective to feed than others, and way more beneficial than just feeding sugar alone. Okay, we still have this question. Why did some? And here's the surprising finding. It looks like it was the balance of the essential amino acids in those subs. This is called Liebig's barrel. That's a good German name right there. What he said was, in any animal diet or any plant nutrients, you need a balance of nutrients. You need so much vitamin C. You need so much calcium, so much zinc, so much of the amino acid tryptophan, so much of the amino acid lysine. And if you took all those perfect proportions and made them all into equal staves of a water barrel, if any one of them is in short supply, that would be the most you could fill that barrel full of water. Optimal growth if they were all up in balance at the top. So it's called the limiting nutrient. If you are a sailor and you're given a perfect diet for 6 months at sea, but there's no vitamin C, that one limiting nutrient, you cannot grow an animal if they don't get quite enough zinc or quite enough lysine or quite enough vitamin A, okay? That can be the limiting nutrient. So this also occurs with the essential amino acids. And bees are unable to sustain brood rearing if a natural pollen is lacking or short in supply of one or more amino acids. For dandelions, which the bees love, you cannot maintain colony growth on all the dandelion pollen you want to give them. The colonies will go downhill because it has a poor balance of amino acids. It's short on a couple of the amino acids. So This happens with natural pollen. It happens the same with a pollen supplement. Okay, so here, if you go right now, back in the 50s, there was the beginning of understanding how to work with animal nutrition and analyze diets and come up with artificial feeds. And nowadays, you can buy, if you're growing chickens, you can get a feed formulated for their first 3 weeks of growth, and then one for the next 2 weeks of growth, and then one for finishing. Same with cattle. You have specific feeds for every age of growth of animals. That was started in the 1950s, and we've made huge progress in every livestock industry except for one. The state of beekeeping knowledge on artificial diets, as far as the amino acids, was published in 1953. I was 2 years old. That is it. That is our current state of knowledge. We are so far behind every other animal industry on this. And all of our knowledge is based upon this one single graph by Antonius de Groot from the Netherlands. Fantastic research. I have an 80-page paper. I have spent months, years studying his research. I have all the respect for him for this, but it's simply the inflection points of these curves here based upon feeding newly emerged adult bees artificial diets with one amino acid held in at different levels, where he determined what the proper ratio of essential amino acids is. And he actually came up very accurately with that. But this is it. This is the entire thing right here. All of our knowledge is based upon that one graph. So de Groot did make one mistake. He was studying ratios, and he made the mistake in one final figure to say, well, you need this to this percent in the diet. But he also very clearly said, but this diet will not be optimal growth. It's only about half of optimal growth. But he should never have published that number, because that's the only number that anybody reads, is this percentage. Forget percentages. If you just cut that one graph table out of his research, you should go by the ratios of them. So here is, in black, is de Groot's minimum value. And when we analyzed all these different pollen subs, they go, wow, he normalized to tryptophan right here. Okay, so these subs had more tryptophan than necessary. They don't look deficient in any of the essential amino acids. But that's not the story. You go, why would there be such an excess of leucine and lysine? These are way more important than tryptophan. That's where de Groot made an error. I have all the respect for him, but he normalized to the wrong essential amino acid. Of the amount of amino acids that the bees need for growth, leucine is by far the most important right here. That's the predominant amino acid. If de Groot had it normalized to leucine, the graph looks very different. And the reason is he shows that if you eliminate one amino acid from the diet, so here's the growth of bees up to 14 days right here. If you knock out leucine, boy, they just stop growing right there. Very important. And this is the amount of nitrogen that goes into their body, meaning it's not just mass, it's the actual protein. Again, leucine really is the critical one. So I focused on the leucine and also on threonine, valine, and histidine. These are the ones that are the most important in limiting bee growth. They can be deficient in the other ones, and they can still keep growing for some time. So now, here's the same graph now. Instead of being normalized to tryptophan, is normalized to leucine, okay? Look at the deficiencies for the critical ones right here. Way deficient in histidine, way deficient in threonine, and way deficient in valine. These are the next three most important acids, and all these diets were deficient in them. When I made this graph, I go, oh, I get goosebumps even looking at it. I just discovered something big. So I created a a calculator, and you guys can download this. It's for free. I created it for beekeepers worldwide who have different ingredients available to them to create their own pollen sibs. I have beekeepers in Arabia saying, Randy, can we use date meal? Or beekeepers in Asia, Randy, can we use rice protein? Or beekeepers in other countries. I said, okay, I'm going to make a universal calculator. You can put in whatever you have available, and you can balance your own pollen sub diet. Now, to test it out, I compared it to, here's the groats, the gray columns. You can pop in the amino acid breakdown of whatever. So in this one, I put in the amino acid breakdown of royal jelly. Notice how closely royal jelly is to the groats ratios. Then I took a mixture of natural pollens that are known by beekeepers to promote high colony growth, the natural pollen mix. Notice how closely that is to the groats ratios. So this validated that my model was good. Then I took the performance of, here's the homebrew and the global, the best performing. Here's the worst performing diets. Notice the difference in amino acid deficiencies. The more deficiencies, the poorer the performance right there. And now this is where Fonny's going to see this one here. For the R-squared value. What would be a really impressive R-squared value in a trial that you would be impressed with and say, yeah, this means something? For your correlation coefficient. What kind of correlation coefficient would impress you in a field trial? Like 60%? Sometimes. In a field trial, it's very, very rarely very high. How about an R-squared of 0.85? That means that 85% of the variation can be described by whatever formula you put in there. And in this case, what I did, I simply added up the proportion of deficiencies of the amino acids relative to leucine, and I could have, before we started, predicted the performance with an 85% accuracy based on their amino acid deficiencies. I found this to be very, very interesting. So then I studied it further, and I realized the groat only worked, and he was very much aware of the shortcomings of his research. He said, I'm only working with adult bees. Ideally, I would be working with the growth of bee larvae and pupae, but he was unable to have a technique for that. So I've done it, and I have 10 articles published on my website just on this trial, so you can read as much depth as you want. But I investigated what the nurse bees actually need. So now we have the groat's suggested ratios and Randy's suggested ratios. And you can put either one into the calculator. You just simply say, oh, I'm going to put in 50 pounds of soy flour and 20 pounds of brewer's yeast right here. And then if I add a tiny amount of amino acid concentrates, I can balance it out to making a almost perfect diet right there. And you can play with this yourself, and anybody in the world can create their own perfectly amino acid balanced diet by the common ingredients. Thank you. So I put the common ingredients here, and then here's a place where you can analyze any ingredient you have, put in the amino acid breakdown, and then you just punch in your proportions, and it tells you exactly what you need to, or you have to, by trial and error, you adjust these amounts, and you watch the columns change until you get them balanced. It's very easy. It's way cool to play with. Okay, so we still need to confirm this more, run some more trials, but very exciting. For a beekeeper that depends upon artificial diets, this is very important to us California beekeepers. Okay, let's jump ahead to 2022. We focused on summertime mite treatments. This is typically in most areas with a short winter break, to really have really good varroa control, it's going to take 3 to 4 treatments to reduce the mite population. I'll be talking much more about this next year. 1 or 2 treatments will not keep the varroa level with most stocks of bees low enough during the year. The hard part is what happens when the honey supers are on during the honey flow. You're limited on the amount of treatments. Right now in the US, formic acid, HopGuard, and oxalic acid are the only ones that are legal to be used. So this is what we focused on with these right here. And I already published research on the HopGuard and to show how that could be used, the hops beta acids from the hops plant. So I'm going to focus now on oxalic acid. Now, this is my grandson. If you grew up in California, every California kid grows up sucking on sour grass, we call it. It's actually Buttercup oxalis. The plant is oxalis. Oxalic acid is named after this plant, the oxalis plant. And when you chew on it, it tastes like lemonade. It's a mixture of sugar and oxalic acid, so it has a lemonade taste, and all of us California kids grow up with it. It causes minor brain damage, and that's why we Californians are all so weird, okay? Come on. Okay, so you're all familiar with the dribble method, putting the 5 milliliters per seam on. Not very efficacious when brood is present. Oops. Oxalic acid vaporization is now approved with the honey supers on in the United States, but the question is how well it works. I've had a number of beekeepers put in sticky boards and count the number of mites fallen per day after oxalic acid vaporizations. I haven't published this yet, but I've analyzed a whole bunch of very meticulous data sets with hundreds of thousands of mites. Here is one. This beekeeper vaporized every 4 days 1 gram per brood chamber, so 2 grams per a double deep Langstroth hive. Every 4 days. Now, if it were efficacious, this is the number of mites. That's 1,000 mites dropping that he counted. If it was efficacious after a couple of days, it would be 0 mites dropping. You see, that does not happen. If you think that 1 or 2 vaporizations, even at 4-day intervals, is going to do anything when there's brood present, you're dreaming. Most of the data sets I analyzed indicated it takes at least 7 vaporizations at that 1 gram rate if there's brood present in the colonies. This paper, just recently published by Cameron Jack, found that 1 gram per Langstroth box is not adequate. That you really want to be up probably around that 2 to 4 grams per box. It takes a higher dose, and the bees appear to tolerate this pretty well. But until it's approved by the regulatory agencies, I am not suggesting that anybody break the law. I'm just telling you the preliminary data. Okay? Everything I do is by permit from the state of California, pesticide research authorization I get every year. Okay, so I was curious, what would happen if you dribbled multiple times, 4 times, 4 days apart? So we tried the 5 milliliters in 50% sugar syrup, also in 40% glycerin instead of the sugar syrup, which a number of beekeepers are trying because the bees don't like the taste of glycerin. So the nurse bees are less likely to consume the oxalic acid and then feed it to the brood. And then Holly Tomema from Estonia suggested using 20 milliliters instead, and he added some thymol, but he found out it was very good at killing varroa, but also had adverse effects on the bees. So I reduced the thymol concentration from what he had suggested. We went out to set up a bunch of hives, and we did 4 dribbles at 4-day intervals to a number of colonies to see how that would work. And here is the final data. The starting mite count is on the blue column on the left. And for the same colony, after 3 weeks later, the ending mite count is on the right. So in this colony, the mite count actually went up. What you want to see is a lot more blue than red. If you see a lot of red, it was not efficacious. If you see a lot of blue, it was efficacious. And here's the control colonies that were untreated right here. And you can see the mite counts generally went up a little bit, about the same as they did in the oxalic acid dribbled colonies. So we did not find 4 treatments at 4 days apart of oxalic acid to be efficacious. But we also measured colony strength before and after, down here. So here's the number of frames of bees. If the colonies grew, you would see more blue. If they shrunk, you would see more red. I'm sorry, if they grew, you'd see more red. If they shrunk, you'd see more blue. The control group all grew. See these numbers going up here? All the treated ones tended not to grow. So there apparently is an adverse effect of 4 oxalic acid dribbles 4 days apart on a colony. So end of discussion for us on the dribbles. Okay, so oxalic acid, it's a food-grade miticide. The FDA is not concerned about you eating it. You can get up to a full gram of oxalic acid in a serving of spinach. So you eat a lot of oxalic acid. So it's not a health issue for humans in any way. The liquid application method is much safer than either using formic acid or oxalic acid vaporization. Safer to the applicator. We don't see any kind of setback in brood rearing other than the dribble. So the vaporization and the extended release, we don't see a setback in brood rearing. But there's very poor efficacy if brood is present. So the Argentinians, back in around 2013, came up with an idea and published the results in 2015 of making an extended release oxalic acid by dissolving it in glycerin and putting it into a cellulose matrix. I've been getting a pesticide research authorization every year from the state of California to follow up on this research. I'm the only beekeeper in the United States allowed to legally do this, okay? That's not to say that I'm the only beekeeper doing it. I'm the only one that's legally doing it, okay? What we found was, remember, you want to see a lot of blue and not much red? Look at these starting mite wash counts. A starting mite wash in a half cup of bees of well over 60 right here, going to 0. If you don't see red, the ending mite count was 0. Very efficacious, and these are all at different yards, so multiple replicas to see what happened. Okay, so the median reduction was 10% of the starting count right there. Now, what was interesting, though, we also have some isolated yards at high elevation where there are no existing honeybees living. It's too cold, too high for them. But we can move our bees up there to the mountains in the summertime, and there's flowers blooming there, but there's no other honeybee colonies around. Okay, I'm sorry, let me do this. Here is, and we use 50 grams of oxalic acid dissolved on this Swedish sponge. Now, much of that oxalic acid is still in the sponge afterwards. 50 grams never went out onto the colony. So the question was, is there an adverse effect on the brood? I will allow you guys to judge whether there's an adverse effect on the brood or not. I get photographs like this from beekeepers all over the world saying, Randy, wow, this is amazing. Our colonies are the most beautiful, most honey productive we've ever seen. This is like beekeeping before Varroa again. This is going to be a game changer. If you guys can get this legalized for you, this is going to be a game changer. My first article that I wrote on this was called Beyond Tactic. Tactic being the amitraz treatment, which is starting to fail or has failed in many countries. And so this may be what's going to replace the use of amitraz by the commercial beekeepers. Okay, here's the results from these high elevation wet meadows right here. The difference there was they made a honey crop during this period of time, during the same treatment period. And they also reared drones like crazy. Now, you know that when colonies are rearing drones, Varroa increases at its highest rate. So Varroa, if anything, should have gone up much higher in these colonies. You ready? You notice the lack of red? Look at these starting mite counts. 50 mites in a half cup of bees, all going to 0. And I don't have the data for another group that we moved up to the state of Nevada to an isolated valley on Lucerne there with no other honeybees. we brought the bees back, and normally those colonies come back from that pollination contract looking like crap. They normally have high mite levels that look terrible. They came back with the most honey and the strongest colonies we had ever seen. So I said, let's do the mite washes. I'm taking the samples, the bee samples. My son Eric is doing the mite washes. And after a little while, I said, Eric, I'm not hearing any numbers. How's it doing? And he goes, Dad, I've never seen so many zeros in a row. They came back 0 counts across the whole thing. So apparently the immigration of mites from other colonies can affect the efficacy of this extended release method. Here's some data I had from 2018 where I actually measured the number of mites immigrating into colonies over time. And it can be a fairly high number coming in. I'll talk later about how we did this. Okay, so one of the questions is, what if putting entrance guards on your colonies, will that reduce mite immigration? So Rose and I set up this field trial here where we applied entrance guards onto half the colonies in 6 different yards, and the other ones we didn't. We took starting mite counts. We just finished taking, just in time to leave for here, ending mite counts, and we haven't had time to process the data yet to see. I'll tell you right now, it's not looking like they made a lot of difference, but we'll see what we can do. The other trial we ran is with 24 colonies. Because we haven't used a synthetic miticide in our operation in over 20 years, our mites are very susceptible to synthetic miticides. So if I want to eliminate all the mites from a colony for a trial, I can use synthetic miticides. So we set up 24 colonies, and we put in 2 strips of apivar, amitraz, 1 strip of fluvalinate, and 1 extended release oxalic acid pad. We wanted to 100% eliminate the mites. That way, once there's no more mites dropping in the sticky boards, you know you've eliminated the mites. Any mites that come in had to come from outside the hive. And here's Rose. We go out every couple of days. We put the guards on half the colonies and not on the other half. And we're looking at the mite drop every few days. And then after we got a baseline value for that mite drop, we swapped the guards from the test group to the control group. And then after we again collected mite drops there, we swapped them back again. So we're going to see whether putting the guards on changes the amount of mite immigration into those hives. And again, so far it's not looking, we haven't cranked the data, but it's not looking too promising. So this trial, we have 150 colonies in 6 different yards. And we again, randomly, we took starting mite counts, randomized block design, so the 2 colonies with the highest mite counts, we flipped a coin, 1 got a guard, 1 didn't. The next two highest mite counts, we flipped a coin, 1 got a guard, 1 didn't. And we just finished collecting data here after 60 days to see whether there's a consistent difference in mite control with a single oxalic acid strip in these colonies. Unfortunately, the oxalic acid strips worked really, really well. I asked my sons earlier, I said, hey, give me a couple of yards of bees with high mite counts to try this on. And they said, too late, Dad. We've already controlled mites in our whole 1,500 hives, and I couldn't find any colonies with high enough mites to start a good trial. So we put a half a treatment on, which in the past, the mites have built up to see what would happen. But this year, we must have had very low mite immigration because we're not seeing what we hope to see. Okay, for the extended release oxalic acid, we know the Swedish sponges work well, but I was curious about using other biodegradable matrices, cotton matrices, and I've already tested a number of different ones. We also know this industrial pad works pretty well, but it's got some drawbacks. It's got a little bit of plastic in it, so I'm not too crazy about that. I'm looking for something that has no plastic particles in it and no other ingredients. So we tried terry cloth cotton, 100% cotton, sweatshirt fleece, 100% cotton, a cotton batting from microwave ovens, 100% cotton, and then compared that to the Swedish sponge. And we checked it for how much oxalic acid and glycerin solution it would absorb. So we know for the Swedish sponge, it's 100 to 112 grams of solution it will absorb. The cotton terry cloth absorbs even more. The sweatshirt fleece, not very much, and the cotton batting, almost exactly the same as the sponges. So we made up the pads like this to try them and went out to 56 hives and applied them in the end of May and then took my final mite counts again in July. So we took starting and ending mite counts as usual. Here's the pads laid out, again, randomly assigned according to starting mite count. End result was we got a goodly amount of blue on this yard. Not as good as we expected, but other than this one outlier here where they didn't go down, the Swedish sponges performed pretty darn good. The other yard had less bloom in it, and we were surprised that none of the other ones, other than the Swedish sponges, performed very well. So we don't know why. These other ones looked very dry, and there's no water here, but there wasn't much glycerin. We don't know why that was. But the bottom line is that Swedish sponges are still the best matrix that we have found. We cut them in half and put 2 half sponges in a hive. Now, here's where we get very interesting. We're curious why this extended release oxalic acid works. Is it due to how much beekeepers say, hey, does this acidify the hive? Is the oxalic acid going to build up in the hive? Have you seen any research at all? Anywhere in the world? We've been using oxalic acid for 30 years in Europe. Any research, has anybody ever measured how much acidity there is in the hive? Yeah. For over the long term? No. I've never found any research at all. So that's what we're doing. So the question is, how long does the acid residues last on the bees? 30 years. We're blind. We don't know what's happening in the hive. So I looked at the registered application of oxalic acid. How many micrograms, how many millionths of a gram, if you do the application according to labeled instructions, and if every bit of that acid went onto the bees' bodies and not somewhere else in the hive, how many micrograms would you expect on average per bee? You with me on this? So by labeled instructions, if you divide the number of bees you apply it to by the total amount of oxalic acid, you can figure out the micrograms per bee. And it's about 100 grams for the dribble. It's about 100 for the spray application. The vapor application is only 50, but we also know that's not efficacious enough. It should be doubled. So that would be 100 micrograms too. So for any of the approved application methods, we know we should have about 100 micrograms per bee to be efficacious. Okay, everybody clear on that? We're looking at that 100 microgram level if every drop went on bee. Now, that won't happen, but we know the rough range of how many millionths of a gram should be on the bee. And a millionth of a gram is a very small amount, I'll tell you right now, very, very small amount. Now, this is called titration. We can use, and I played a lot with this in 2018, and then in 2018 had to shelve it because I hit a wall, and then when Rose started working with me this spring, I said, okay, we're going to pick up from 2018, Rose. You're going to help me pick it back up on this and get the data for here. So that's what we're doing right now. So you use a titrant that colors the water to a specific color according to the pH, okay? How much acid there is. Now, this doesn't tell you that it's oxalic acid, but what I'm doing is we're using oxalic acid equivalents. So we make a standardized solution of oxalic acid dissolved in water so we know how many drops to put in, which equals 1 microgram. And from that, then, we can tell how many micrograms of acid equivalent are on the bee's body. So you start off with this blue color right here. Then you drop a bee in, and if it turns anywhere towards yellow, that means it's acid, okay? And then you drop in the titrant 1 drop at a time and count the number of drops. This titrant is calibrated to equal 1 microgram of oxalic acid equivalent. We also have one that's 10 micrograms of oxalic acid equivalent. So we can figure out how many drops. And when you turn that solution back to the starting color, then we know we're there. And we can tell you how many micrograms of acidity are on that bee. And here's what happened in 2018. I'll be working on the bench, titrating. Oh, yeah, these bees here all have about this many micrograms. And I'd walk away for 3 days and come back, and there's no acid on the bees, no acidity. And I go, what the heck? So we want to know how rapidly it degrades. So this was Rose's first job when she started with me. We set up a trial. We took bees out of a hive with no acid residues, froze them to kill them, and then dipped them very quickly into different solutions of oxalic acid, and then let them dry at room temperature right here. And we also vaporized a hive right here, and then took the bees out. You can see the oxalic acid crystals on the bees' setae right there. Higher up, magnification, here's the oxalic acid crystals on their hairs right there. This one right here, at this rate, looking at that, you'd probably be about 200, 300 micrograms on that particular bee. Very high dose right here. 1,000 micrograms, the bee dies. Okay? Then we also put some oxalic acid in water, a drop on a plastic cover slip, so no organic matter. Over 12 days, no degradation of the acid on there. But if you mixed it with either sugar or glycerin, so the green is mixed with sugar, the orange with glycerin, it very rapidly drops down. This is in the first hours. This is 12 hours right here. Within 12 hours, most of the acidity has disappeared, simply by mixing it with glycerin or sugar. Okay, then we tried it. Okay, so that was on, this is on the bees. This is oxalic acid with glycerin on plastic right here, the dotted one, and even on the plastic it dropped down. Okay, so these are on the bees, dead bees, dried bees' bodies, measuring how rapidly it degrades. So this is the first 12 hours, then we went to bed, and then this is over the next 12 days right here. And it drops down to very, very low amounts of right here. This is at 10 micrograms per drop. So since that was one drop, that means you're about the 10 microgram level, down from this high starting of 100 microgram level. So this is, we did it, so we started out at that 100 microgram level. So in a few days, you're down to a very low level. Okay, that was lab work, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. So the vaporized is the red line right here. So vaporized, it actually tends to go up in the first few hours, and then it starts to drop off very rapidly. So that's the vaporized there. Sorry, I missed that. Thank you. Did that answer your question? Okay. So now let's move from the lab to the field. Here's Rose out here. We start out working with this bench outside, her titrating right here. So we'll start off with, and we're just learning how to do this. And unfortunately, we started this trial. We knew we were leaving from this trip. We wanted to get data before then. So instead of planning this, we just threw it together in one day, really quick to get data before we came to this trip. So I was using carbon dioxide to anesthetize some bees. So we start off with the titrant at that color. And you can see, and we always keep one with no bees so we can compare to that. Now you add bees to it. You can see more acid on these. This is 10 bee samples right here. So we come up with an average per bee for 10 bees. And we've done 1 bee titrations, 3 bee, 5 bee, 10 bees. But this is some preliminary research right here. And when we titrate them back to the same color, that was divide by 10 per bee. So that would be an average of 5 micrograms per bee, 6 micrograms per bee, and 3 micrograms per bee. Okay, equivalence. Okay, so we can get down to single millionths of a gram per bee equivalence. At that time, we had some colonies. We had finished the trial that still had the Swedish sponges in. They'd been in for 70 days. So I was curious, well, how many micrograms after 70 days of continual oxalic acid exposure? So set up the titration tubes. We can do this right outdoors in the yard and start dropping bees in. We put 3 in each one there. And you can see there was still acidity compared to the reference one right here. And when we tried untreated hives that had not got oxalic acid treatment, they're always neutral. You can drop bees in, there's no color change at all. You have to have acid residues to get a color change. So then we set up a trial with 1 colony each, only an N of 1. Okay, so I'm not going to drop, it's not going to for scientific publication, of every application method of oxalic acid we could think of. Vaporization at 3 times the allowed dose. So 6 grams per double deep colony. Okay, 3 kinds of dribbling with sugar, with glycerin, or with propylene glycol, which is similar to glycerin, but has a lower surface tension. Sponges, oxalic acid sponge, not in the middle of the hive, but on the landing board just inside the entrance and above the cluster, so not in the middle. Okay, then 2 replicas of sponges in between the 2 brood nests with a 1-to-1 ratio, 1 gram of oxalic acid to 1 gram of glycerin, 1 gram of oxalic acid to 2 grams of glycerin, 1 gram of oxalic acid to 1 gram of propylene glycol. And then how about citric acid? We made up sponges with citric acid. How about sodium bisulfite, another food-grade acid? How about a sponge with oxalic acid with no glycerin? And then the New Zealanders use cardboard strips, and they hang them over the top bars. So they recommend using a 1 to 1.5 oxalic acid to glycerin. So we did my 1-to-1 ratio, their 1 to 1.5, and then use the Argentinian ratio, which is much higher glycerin, which I found causes adverse effects to colonies. So we were curious what would happen with that higher ratio. Then a control colony with no treatment, and then 2 half shop towels, which I played with originally. And then we wanted to start titrating this over time. This is just outside my house, and 1 colony of each one. Unfortunately, these colonies, at that time, I had a hard time finding any colonies that didn't already have some small, tiny level of oxalic acid ratio. So some of them already had 1 to 2 micrograms baseline value. So we took 3 5B samples from the same comb of every hive, day after day after day, and Rose titrated them. And days off, sometimes she would take the B samples and titrate, sometimes I would take the B samples and titrate, but we wanted to get a long data set. And you can see sometimes the acid residues were rather high on the bees. Pick them up with clean forceps and drop them into these tubes. We set up, again, trial and error. We came up with a method of doing this very quickly. And we're filming a video, and we'll show other researchers how to do this. There's a lot of little tricks for doing this, but this is incredibly precise. Okay, so then I went into one of my laboratories, and I set up a special table for Rose to sit with an air conditioner on her because it was very hot. So this is Rose's station right here for titrating them. And there she is doing some titration and recording the data for all those samples. We are now unblinded. We can now tell you exactly how much acidity is on the bees' bodies over time. We're up to a full month right now. When we get back, we'll resume, and we're going to go for 2 months on these colonies. You guys ready to be unblinded? Okay, first, this is for a dribble right here, starting at 2.5 hours after the dribble. Just about 100 micrograms, okay? What you would expect, okay? But by the next day, we're down to less than 10 micrograms per bee. So as far as longevity on the bees, it's not on the bees for very long, okay? It drops off. That's why we don't see that prolonged effect from the vaporization or from the dribbles, okay? It disappears very, very quickly. And then I retreated with a dribble on this date, and you see it went, and this is after a day, it went up a little bit, but not very much. This is for the vaporization and the dribbles. So vaporization is the black line, and these are all standardized now to 20 micrograms, because after the first day, nobody was over 20 micrograms. So you get the next 3 graphs, you can all compare the same numbers on the y-axis. So we're starting out about, maybe 10 micrograms for B on day 2, and then it drops down like this, and then we retreated with the dribbles again on this date, and it jumped back up right here. So you pretty much drop down to that 2 to 4 microgram level on the bees for a while. We'll see. So this is for the first month. We will see what happens by the end of the second month when we get back. These are for the sponge applications, okay? Where with the citric acid started out really, really high, but pretty much they all kind of stabilized around this same level. Now, there's a huge B to B variation. So if we did individual B samples, you would have some very high and some very low. These are 5B averages. But even with 5B averages, you can see the variation on that. There's a huge B to B variation within the hive of these residues. But overall, we can see they start out up here, maybe around the 10 or a bit less, and then they just kind of hold for a very, very long time. The oxalic acid, it degrades quickly and then stops disappearing. For the New Zealand strips and the shop towels, again, we start out at a fairly high level and then just kind of stabilize again around that 4 microgram level. So we now have questions, okay, on this still. Oh, we also were curious, what happens? Where does the acid go? Why does it disappear? So we're using fluorescent tracers, and we added a fluorescent tracer that glows under black light. We built a box that we could, with black lights inside, we put our camera up to there, and we could film it. Or go out in the field with a black light flashlight and put a black tarp over us, and look. You can see the glow. See the little glows right here? That means that's oxalic acid, are the tracer residues of the oxalic acid solution after a dribble. It's only on little tiny spots, a little bit on the comb right there, some drops, but these are the little bits on bees' bodies. So there's only little minute drops on the bees' bodies. But it is in the combs. But what we noticed is, after 2 days, you don't even see it on the combs. Where does it go? So I mixed it up and put it on with a paintbrush on the combs with no bees whatsoever. So it never went on the bees' bodies. And then I returned the combs to the hive. And after 3 days, I didn't show it. After 3 days, there's hardly any on the combs. It all disappears. That tracer does. So we're not measuring acidity. We're just using the fluorescent tracer in the solution. So we took samples of bees off the combs and froze them, and we had to leave for this trip. I tried to get the analysis done before we left, but I can't tell you the results. They're in the freezer right now. When we get back, we are going to crush the bees in their guts and look for the glow of the tracer to tell whether they are eating it or whether they're just chewing it off and disposing of it. Okay? So we're deep into oxalic acid research right now. If you haven't got the message on that. The next thing is, why does that 2 or 3 microgram level on the extended release continue to affect the varroa mites? That's a very low level of acidity. I don't know that it causes acute toxicity. So I'm wondering, in the process, when it gets neutralized with the sugar or the glycerin, or if you just put it on the bees' bodies with no sugar or glycerin, it degrades very quickly. There's a chemical reaction with a chitin on the bees' bodies. Does that chemical reaction change the volatile hydrocarbons emanating from the bees' bodies. And then, because the odor of the bees has changed, does that prevent Varroa from identifying the right bees to hitchhike a ride on or the right bees to get into the combs? So I set up this was 2 days before we left this trip, a bioassay that I could put bees into either side, one treated with oxalic acid and one not. This is just preliminary. And then take live mites, shake them into the middle of here, and see which direction the live mites work, whether they go to the bees that were treated with oxalic acid or not treated. I will resume this research as soon as we get back home. Okay? So, take-homes. Oxalic acid initially degrades very rapidly in the hive. But then there's a low level of acidity that persists for a very, very long time. Somehow, that low level appears to decrease the Varroa population. We don't know why. We're talking about 2 micrograms per bee. That's nothing. So that's where we're at right now. Plenty of new research to go. Another question. Any burning question? Well, how much time do we have left? Anybody know? I'm already over? Okay. Oh, I've got another hour's worth of research on here. Tell you what, I'll do one more. Beekeeper said, in old brood comb, how much propolis is there in old brood combs? There's some recent research saying that propolis might be useful for Varroa control. Would the bees put it in the brood comb? So I said, well, that's really easy to tell. You simply take brood comb, old dark brood comb, and then you scrape some propolis and you put it into different solvents, into hexane, ethanol, or acetone, and see if it dissolves. Obviously, propolis immediately dissolves in ethanol. You've all made propolis tincture, and it turns it brown. It also dissolves also in the acetone. So then put in some old dark brood comb and see if it turns brown. Almost none. There appears to be almost no propolis in old dark brood comb. Okay? That's a quick experiment. All right. Thank you, guys. There you go.
Ja. Also, das war schwere Kost. Gell? Das war jetzt kein einfaches Ding, der Unterhaltungsprogramm da am Abend. Gell? Und das wollen wir aber wissen hier. Gell? Wo geht sie hin? Und warum schadet es nicht beim Streifen? Und bei der Verdampfung ist die Frage zu stellen, gibt es denn einen besseren Abstand als 4 Tage?
It doesn't appear to, from mite population dynamics, it doesn't really make any difference how far apart they are. For Varroa control, when you have an exponential growth curve, if you do a 50% reduction, it doesn't make any difference if you do it 2 days apart or 6 days apart. The end result is exactly the same. So understand exponential growth. Try it out. Go to my mite model and see. So that timing apparently is not important. It's just how many times you do it. For the extended release, who knows? We have researchers who get paid good money to figure this out. We should understand these methods that are registered for use and understand the mechanism. I'm frustrated because nobody else is doing this. I'm just a podunk beekeeper from California, okay? Rose didn't know anything about bees, and we're trying to answer your questions for beekeepers worldwide, but that's what we like doing. So, no answers yet.
Also, genau, wir sind daran interessiert und diese Rose, wenn du sie fertig ausgebildet hast, stünde die dann zur Verfügung? Eine Stunde Pause, 20:15 Uhr geht's weiter.